What's up, dogs? So, I am an empiricist. But what is it to be an empiricist? Well, in this video, we're going to examine that question, focusing in particular on the work of Bas van Fraassen. His book, The Empirical Stance, contains a useful discussion of empiricism that frames the debate about empiricism in what I think is a fairly novel and insightful way. So, empiricism is, of course, a philosophical position, and so perhaps we should start with the more general question, well, what is a philosophical position? Philosophical positions are often stated in terms of beliefs. So according to Van Fraassen, most philosophers are committed to what he calls principle zero, which says that for each philosophical position X, there exists a statement X plus, such that to have position X is to believe or decide to believe that X plus. So X plus is the doctrine of X. Now, if we're construing philosophical positions as beliefs, then that principle is surely true. All it says is that in order to count as holding a certain position, you must believe a certain statement that is defining of that position. A simple example of this would be to be a Cartesian dualist is to believe that mind and matter are distinct substances. The distinctness of mind and matter is a belief about the world, and it is the doctrine of Cartesian dualism. Note that we might take X plus not to be a single belief, but to be a cluster of beliefs. I mean, maybe no particular belief in that cluster is necessary to count as an adherent of the position. Maybe it's more like you need a sufficient but vague number of the beliefs. You know, whatever. It doesn't matter whether we think of X plus as a single belief or as a kind of vague cluster. Anyway, applying this to empiricism, we end up we have it that there exists a statement, call it E plus, such that to be an empiricist is to believe E plus. So that's our assumption, or NE for naive empiricism. To be an empiricist is to believe E plus. That seems reasonable. There are many different empiricists. What makes them all empiricists is that they all believe E plus. The question then is, what is E plus? What is the belief that is the doctrine of empiricism? Well, we can begin thinking about this by turning to what we might call textbook empiricism. Empiricism as it is commonly understood in recent philosophy, empiricism as it is commonly presented to people learning philosophy for the first time. If you open a philosophy textbook, you will probably find a couple of common definitions of empiricism. So first of all, there is empiricism in terms of concepts, concept empiricism. On this view, to be an empiricist is to believe that all concepts are derived from sense experience. That is, there are no innate concepts. This is the classic debate between Locke and Leibniz. In Locke's famous metaphor, the mind is a tabula rasa, a blank slate upon which sensory experience writes. All of our ideas are either directly copied from impressions or are constructed from ideas copied from impressions by some mental operation. So I have, say, the ideas of horse, horn, and white just on the basis of sensory experience, right? Like I open my eyes right now, I'm looking at a white wall. So I've got the whiteness, the idea of white, that's sensory experience. If I look out my window, maybe I can see a horse. I mean, I can't because I don't live on a farm, but you know, maybe I see a horse sometimes, so I get the idea of horse, and I see another animal with a horn, so I get the idea of horn, and then I can combine them, right, into the idea of unicorn. So even though I've never directly seen a unicorn, that's constructed out of simpler ideas that were derived directly from sensory experience. So, you know, I mean, this is perfectly familiar, right? Empiricism about concepts. And then by contrast, the rationalists, like Leibniz, they held there were certain ideas whose content exceeds that which can be provided by sensory experience. Leibniz compared the mind to a veined block of marble. If you take a veined block of marble and hit it with a chisel, it breaks apart more readily along certain lines. The veins mark out a particular shape. And so, although labour is required to reveal the shape, in a sense the shape is already there. It's already in the marble waiting to be revealed. So it is, according to Leibniz, with respect to the mind and at least some of its concepts. The mind has certain innate dispositions, inclinations, habits that we are predisposed to develop particular ideas as a result of experience. Or maybe another way to look at it is that the mind gives form to the materials provided by experience. Anyway, That's concept empiricism, and this idea of concept empiricism was a powerful tool for the British empiricists, and it had particularly radical consequences in Berkeley and Hume. Concept empiricism was able to frame a particular philosophical program. It was now the task of philosophers to show how to derive various concepts from sense experience. Complex ideas must be broken down into simple ideas, and then these ideas related to sensory impressions. And if this derivation could not be done, if a purported concept could not be shown to be derived from the materials of experience, then the purported concept was held to be meaningless. That was the basis of things like Hume's critique of the self, Hume's view of causation, Berkeley's critiques of matter, and things like that. So, this was, as I say, a powerful tool. Obviously, this way of thinking about empiricism captures something important about an influential stage in the history of philosophy. But there's an obvious problem with defining empiricism in this way, with treating this claim about concepts as what it is to be an empiricist. The claim that there are no innate concepts is, assuming it's meaningful at all, it's a purely psychological thesis. It's a claim about the operation of the human mind. It's also obviously questionable. There's not any particular reason why we should think it's true. Your body is not an undifferentiated mass. You're born with certain bodily features. Why wouldn't the mind come into the world with a certain structure? Actually, no, even worse, right? There are positive reasons to think that this thesis is false. Indeed, some of these problems were known at the time to the British empiricists themselves. Hume's missing shade of blue is a classic example. So Hume imagines a person who has seen lots of shades of blue except one, call it shade Z. Now, if you line up all the shades of blue in front of this person, leaving a gap where shade Z would go, would this person be able to imagine shade Z? Well, intuitively, yes. But if that's the case, this person certainly, they haven't derived that from like copying a sensory impression, right? This person seems to have an idea that is not copied from a sensory impression. So just a few other similar points that might be raised here. What about abstraction, right? Like, I have the concept red. I've developed this concept by abstracting from various particular shades of colour. I never experience red in general. I only experience specific shades. So if you take two different shades of red, what do they have in common? Well, they're both part of a range of colours that I've designated red, but that classification scheme is not forced on me by experience. And in fact, that's well demonstrated by the fact that other cultures have used different colour classifications. Indeed, with this point in mind, it's not actually clear how to even state what the deliverances of experience in themselves are. So in order to describe our experience at all, it seems like we need to assume some prior conceptual scheme, some sort of way of classifying, and that way of classifying will not itself be given in experience. More recently, you have things like Chomsky's poverty of the stimulus argument, which attempts to show that children are not exposed to enough linguistic information to develop an understanding of the grammar of their language from that information alone, which suggests that certain structural rules of grammar are innate. Finally, there are problems with the very idea of innateness, which arguably renders this whole debate meaningless. So what is it for any trait to be innate? All traits are a product of the interaction between genes and environment, and genes do not specify particular traits in anything like the way that an architect's blueprint specifies the characteristics of a building. There's always this interaction, whether you're talking about bodily traits or mental traits. I have a video series on innateness. I'm not going to go into it here, but you can check out my series on innateness if you are interested in learning more about this. But anyway, look, so there's a bunch of problems with concept empiricism. No doubt there are answers to all of these points, because there's never going to be a knockdown argument against any substantive position. The key point is this. If we view empiricism as a claim about how we develop concepts, this turns empiricism into a psychological thesis. And this thesis had obvious problems even in the past, and it appears to have been refuted in modern psychology. And I mean, in fact, from the point of view of modern psychology, it's hard to even state what this thesis amounts to. Now, it would seem a little bit odd for a general philosophical position, a general worldview, to end up just amounting to psychology and to being refuted by psychology. Indeed, if empiricism is defined as the view that there are no innate concepts, it seems a little hard to account for the continuing influence of empiricists, of the major empiricists like Hume and Berkeley, right? Like their basic views would be fairly trivially false. Okay, so let's grant that concept empiricism doesn't work. An alternative way of thinking about empiricism, an alternative textbook definition, as it were, we might frame empiricism in terms of justification. To be an empiricist is to believe that all knowledge is justified on the basis of sense experience. Experience is the source and foundation for knowledge. So, on this view, we may well have innate ideas. We may well have ideas that cannot be derived from sense experience, but these are not going to provide any justification for our beliefs. Right? If you want, justification comes from experience. A classic statement of this approach to empiricism, which is actually slightly weaker than this, is to say that there is no synthetic a priori knowledge. That is, there is no a priori knowledge of the world. The only propositions that we can know a priori, the only propositions that we can know independently of experience, are analytic truths, truths concerning the relations of our concepts. So I can know a priori that all bachelors are unmarried because the term bachelor is just defined to mean unmarried man. But that tells me nothing about the way the world is. All knowledge of matters of fact is built on experience. If I want to know whether there actually are any bachelors, I have to do some empirical investigation. And it's not something I can just figure out by like intellectual intuition, by pure reason or anything like that. I have to actually go out and observe things. And that's the case for all synthetic propositions. Whenever we, for any proposition that is not just true or false in virtue of meaning, we have to go out and investigate the world. Now, this kind of view cannot be refuted by psychology because it's not a claim about how we develop concepts or about the causal operations of our minds. It's a claim about justification. Now, so again, there are problems with this way of thinking about empiricism. Van Fraassen certainly thinks that this way of approaching empiricism ended in failure. And in fact, the failure was clear even by around the time of Hume. How could all knowledge derive from sense experience? We know various things beyond what we immediately experience. We know various general claims, such as all metals expand when heated. We know claims about the future, such as tomorrow the sun will rise. The trouble is that there simply is no means, on the basis of experience itself, of deriving any information beyond what is immediately experienced. There's no way of deriving any general information or information about the future. To put it another way, experience provides no means for ampliative inference. From going beyond what we are currently experiencing. This is the problem of induction. And I'm assuming that you're familiar with this. If not, I have some videos on Hume's problem of induction, should you need to remind yourself of what that is. But anyway, experience in itself logically implies nothing beyond whatever it is you're experiencing at the time. So, the empiricist seems to face a fairly uncomfortable dilemma here. First option is to just renounce induction, renounce ampliative inference. And that seems to compel us to renounce knowledge of any general claims. It compels us to renounce knowledge of the future. We can only know our what we're currently experiencing and anything that logically follows from that. But pretty much nothing logically follows from that. So this is a skeptical disaster. It would render us unable to perform even the simplest actions. Right? Why take the stairs rather than jump out the window if I have no better reason to believe that jumping out the window will result in my death? So the second option then is to admit some sort of non-analytic principle which is not derived from experience, which will allow you to infer various claims from experience. So This might be something like the uniformity of nature assumption, right? Like that will allow you to Hume suggests at least that if we can assume that nature is uniform, then we can use that to justify inductive inferences. But of course, if you're admitting these sorts of principles, then you're just abandoning empiricism. A further problem here is that there's actually an internal problem with taking experience as the foundation of knowledge. So let's consider this claim, right, that experience provides the foundation of knowledge. Why should we accept this? Why should we think that experience can work in this way, can work as a foundation? I mean, clearly, this claim needs to be argued for, right? We can't just assume that this is true. There are plenty of philosophers who reject it, both rationalists and skeptics. So there are two alternatives, right? The first option is to attempt to argue for this claim within experience, as it were. We can try to argue for this claim by building on nothing but experience. So we can try to use experience itself to show that experience is the only foundation for knowledge. Now, I mean, so in the first place, it's far from clear what this argument could possibly be. Experience is not self-verifying, as it were, at least not in any, it's not in any obvious way. It's just not at all clear how you can kind of get from experience alone to the claim that experience is the only foundation for knowledge. But more importantly, even if you did give an argument, it looks like this argument would be plainly circular, because we would be justifying experience as a source of knowledge by appealing to experience. How could that possibly be convincing to somebody who is skeptical that experience can play this role? I mean, this is analogous to Hume's point about induction. It's circular to say that induction is justified because induction has worked in the past, because you're justifying induction by appealing to induction. So the second option is we can provide an argument from outside the empiricist framework. That is, we can give an argument that appeals to something outside of experience for this claim that all knowledge is based on experience, or that experience is the only foundation for knowledge. Well, this is obviously self-defeating, right? We'd be justifying empiricism on a non-empiricist basis. We'd be giving up on the idea that all knowledge is based on experience. By hypothesis, whatever materials we're drawing on to justify the claim that all knowledge is based on experience are themselves justified by something other than experience. So that's not going to work either. So that looks like a pretty big problem. Okay, so look, we've moved fairly rapidly through some of the difficulties with textbook empiricism. And these sorts of arguments are not going to be absolutely conclusive, but there are some fairly deep problems with these kinds of empiricism. There are problems of empirical refutation, problems of internal coherence. And I mean, we can also add that if we're proposing these as definitions of empiricism, we're also going to run into the problem that very few of the people that we would all identify as major empiricists actually held these views, right? So if you think that empiricism just is the claim, that there are no innate concepts, or something like that, then again, it's going to turn out that actually many people that are traditionally identified as empiricists aren't actually empiricists, because they don't hold that view. So can we do better than this? Well, perhaps the difficulty here lies in principle 0, in the claim that holding a philosophical position must consist in believing some statement. Remember that in the case of empiricism, we had NE. To be an empiricist is to believe that E+. On this approach, empiricism is a doctrine, a belief, or at least a set of beliefs. Now, Van Fraassen points out a very general problem with any attempt to frame empiricism as a doctrine. And maybe the issues that we've seen with concept empiricism and justification empiricism are like a product of this type of problem in a way. But there's a very general problem. No matter how we define what the belief is, we're going to face this issue. So our question is, what is E+? Well, okay, there are a couple of general things we can say about what E+ would need to be, right? E+ would need to have certain features. So E plus would need to ground the empiricist critique of metaphysics, for one thing. And it would itself obviously need to be invulnerable to that critique. If E plus is to do any work, if E plus is to be significant, then it can't be a tautology. It can't be something trivial like all bachelors are unmarried. Okay, a statement like that doesn't tell us anything about anything except how we've defined our terms. E plus must be a factual thesis, and it must involve some claim about the human epistemic position. And that's got to imply either the falsehood or the untenability or the meaninglessness or whatever of metaphysics in order for the empiricist critique of metaphysics to work. Now, obviously, E plus itself can't be a piece of metaphysics, so it must be a factual claim of a scientifically respectable sort, or at least empiricists must treat E plus as being open to debate. Indeed, this is one of the key characteristics of empiricism. No factual claim can be ruled out a priori. Disagreement with any factual hypothesis is admissible in the sense that every factual hypothesis is put to the test. Every factual hypothesis is held to be at least potentially true. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we will, in practice, take every hypothesis seriously. We now know that the Earth is a globe, and this has been well established for thousands of years, and scientists don't need to worry about arguing with flat earthers anymore. They don't need to take the flat Earth as a serious possibility. But at an earlier stage, flat Earth theory would have been admitted into the conceptual arena, and it was put to the test. For all the early Greeks knew, it might have been true. How did they show that it wasn't true? By conducting experiments. And ultimately, in the end, science didn't accept the spherical Earth because, spherical Earth was the word of God, or because spherical Earth was supported by tradition, or because the spherical Earth was the deliverance of intellectual intuition, or whatever. No, instead, we put a variety of positions against the tribunal of experience, and the spherical Earth won out. So, the empiricist attitude is, as Van Fraassen puts it, as in science, so in philosophy. Disagreement with any factual hypothesis is admissible in the sense that disagreement is in principle acceptable. We don't rule out hypotheses a priori. But now we face an obvious problem, because we've said by NE, to be an empiricist is to believe that E plus. And a corollary of NE is that the empiricist critique of some metaphysical claim M will involve showing that M is incompatible with E plus. So, think of those empiricists who criticise a metaphysical hypothesis by showing that it can't be supported by experience, or by showing that the concepts involved in its statement can't be derived from experience, or whatever. What we're saying here, in other words, is that hypotheses that are incompatible with the empiricist doctrine E plus are not admissible. But for the empiricist, disagreement with any factual hypothesis is admissible. Disagreement over claims about what the world is like is permitted. We don't rule out alternative hypotheses a priori. We can put this in the form of a dilemma. Suppose that E plus is taken by the empiricist to be not open to debate. So contraries to E plus are inadmissible. Well, then we are ruling out factual hypotheses a priori, and this violates the empiricist's anti-dogmatic attitude. We have made E plus into exactly the kind of metaphysics shielded from criticism that empiricism claims to reject. On the other hand, suppose E plus is open to debate, so that contraries to E plus are admissible. Well, in that case, the empiricist has lost any radical critique of metaphysics. Metaphysics is not problematic in principle, even by the empiricist's lights. Now, of course, the empiricist may still be able to critique some specific metaphysical claims. In the same way, we can criticise specific claims in all fields, right? Like a scientist might reject a specific version of the Big Bang model, for example. But the point is that once the empiricist admits that contraries to E plus are admissible, are open to debate, she no longer has any general critique of metaphysical theorising. The most the empiricist can say to the metaphysician is, well, okay, let's each explore the factual hypotheses that we both favour. I favour E plus, you favour this hypothesis that contradicts E plus. let's both go on our way. There's no critique of the metaphysical project in itself. So, I mean, maybe one way to see this is to apply this to an example. Consider three philosophers, Frank, Vincent, and Don. Frank and Vincent are both empiricists. Don is a metaphysician. Suppose that Frank and Vincent have some disagreement about a factual matter. And this can be anything you like. I mean, maybe Frank believes that eating red meat is associated with a higher risk of cancer, whereas Don does not. What's Frank going to say about this? Well, something like, okay, I disagree with Vincent, but the mistaken beliefs he holds are admissible because they're compatible with E plus, right? You know, we're both, you know, taking these beliefs, putting them against the tribunal of experience, whatever. They're both admissible. They're both, you know, within this realm of like reasonable debate. Now, what will he say to Don with respect to Don's belief in some speculative metaphysical hypothesis? Well, in this case, if Frank is to be an empiricist, he's going to want to mount some kind of substantive critique. He will want to say it's not just that Don is mistaken, but that the very project that Don is engaging in is misguided. But Frank has no way to do this on the basis of E+. If contraries to E+ are admissible, it's just going to become a standard factual disagreement, like his disagreement with Vincent. So I mean, this is, you know, this argument is maybe a little bit abstract, so it might be worth framing it in a different way. So I'm going to present what is essentially the same argument again, but again in different terms. So the central claim of empiricism is something like this: there is no a priori knowledge, or experience is our only source of information, or whatever. Okay, you know, whatever E+ is, it's going to be something like that. Every factual hypothesis must be subjected to testing against observation before it's accepted or rejected. Whatever E+ is, it had better entail that no hypotheses can be ruled out a priori. Here's the problem. Consider some non-empiricist metaphysical hypothesis M. M denies or entails the denial of the claim that there is no a priori knowledge. So the metaphysician disagrees with E+. Now, if we accept empiricism, we must accept that the dispute between E+ and M cannot be decided a priori. I mean, you know, this is just the central claim of empiricism, right? The problem here is that E+ tells us that M must be wrong, right? Like, given that we accept E+, we can immediately derive that M is false. M entails that there is a priori knowledge, but we accept E+, according to which there is no a priori knowledge, so we must reject M. But now we're rejecting M a priori. So empiricism is incoherent. E+ entails that we cannot rule out M a priori, and that we can rule out M a priori. So if this is right, if this argument is right, then we shouldn't think of empiricism as being a doctrine. We shouldn't think of it as a belief. Contrary to principle 0, a philosophical position can consist in something other than a belief. But if empiricism is not a belief, what is it? Van Fraassen suggests that empiricism should instead be thought of as a stance, where a stance involves a cluster of attitudes, commitments and goals, and which may at some given time involve or presuppose certain beliefs, but it cannot be equated with any set of beliefs. Stances can survive through changes of belief, even fairly radical changes of belief. And this is why when we examine the history of philosophy, we find the empiricist attitude recurring. There are various philosophers through various eras that we can speak of as embodying the empiricist stance, despite fairly radical differences in worldview. So as Van Fraassen puts it, the story of empiricism is a story of recurrent rebellion against a certain systematizing and theorizing tendency in philosophy. The story of empiricism is the story of rebellion against metaphysics. Think of Aristotle against Plato, with Aristotle emphasizing empirical inquiry, disdain towards high theory, and Plato's postulation of ideal forms. or the 14th century nominalists who rebelled against an Aristotelian tradition that had drifted somewhat from Aristotle's more empirical focus, or the British empiricists who rebelled against the sort of systematizing continental philosophers. So, there are lots of other cases. In each of these cases, we can speak of an empiricist attitude, an empiricist stance in philosophy. Of course, to modern eyes, we see in all of these cases beliefs that might strike us as rather strange for an empiricist. Look at how Berkeley, one of the great British empiricists, appeals to God to ensure the coherence of his philosophical system. That's an example of a move that may not be particularly empiricist, but Berkeley's attacks on representationalism, his attack on the explanatory value of materialism, on the primary secondary quality distinction, that's all a great expression of an empiricist stance. So we can certainly speak of an empiricist attitude there. Obviously, people can embody the empiricist stance to more or less of a degree. So let's try to state this a little bit more precisely. What we see recurring across the ages is a philosophical stance with two general parts. There's a positive part and a negative part. Bear in mind that my description here is not intended to be complete, because working out the empiricist stance is going to be an ongoing project. But anyway, having said that, the positive part. The positive part emphasises anti-dogmatism, fallibilism. It involves a general admiration for the norms of the natural sciences, including the idea that no hypothesis should be ruled out a priori, which, as we saw, is the source of the dilemma that arises when treating empiricism as a doctrine. So a couple of characteristics then. First characteristic, the empiricist will say something like that the process of science is a paradigm of rational inquiry. They will treat empirical science as the kind of ideal form of rational inquiry. This is the empiricist's strongly positive attitude towards science. Now, note that what matters for the empiricist is not really the content of science. It's not how its theories and models describe the world, but rather its practices, its norms, its methods. What empiricists find admirable is how scientists go about testing their hypotheses. This is an important point because there are many different ways of admiring science. Physicalists or materialists also have a strongly positive attitude towards science, but for them it's more the content of science that is the object of their admiration. They're impressed by how our best theories and models describe the world, and part of their attitude, part of their kind of approach to philosophy is they structure their beliefs and their attitudes around the assumption that science provides reasonably complete and reasonably accurate descriptions of the way the world is. Science is approximately true. So one way to put this is in terms of the distinction between process and product. Empiricists emphasize the process of science, physicalists tend to emphasize the product of science. For the empiricist, as Van Fraassen puts it, it's not so much that science teaches us what to believe, rather science teaches us how to give up our beliefs. So it's an emphasis on the practices and the norms and methods. Now, of course, E1 is what embodies the empiricist's emphasis on experience as an arbiter of theory choice. The claim is not that all concepts are drawn from experience, or even that all knowledge derives from experience, or anything like that. Rather, the point is we must do what we can to bring any factual hypotheses to empirical test. And when people propose factual hypotheses and then work to shield them from empirical testing, we can rightly be suspicious of what those people are up to. And now notice actually that empirical test doesn't simply mean experience in the traditional sense. Science doesn't simply test claims against experience. Experience in science becomes highly regimented, right? We work out quantitative predictions from our theories, which specify very particular observations as relevant, and then we run controlled experiments in what might be highly artificial conditions. In Francis Bacon's famous phrase, we torture nature for her secrets. So, certainly a lot of empiricists in the past tended to kind of think of like experience as this thing that's just kind of given to us, and we construct knowledge on that basis. But actually, if you're taking empirical science as a paradigm of rational inquiry, you can see that that's sort of a silly way of thinking. Anyway, the next characteristic: disagreement with any factual hypothesis is admissible. Admissible in the sense that any factual hypothesis should be, you know, put to the test, put in the arena of debate. No factual hypothesis can be ruled out a priori. The empiricist then has a general tolerance of disagreement on factual questions. And again, you know, this is part of what embodies the empiricist's emphasis on experience in theory choice. Perhaps the word of God is that the universe is geocentric, or that humans do not share a common ancestor with other species. Or perhaps that is what pure reason tells us, or whatever, or what tradition tells us. But that kind of thing is just irrelevant to the empiricist. These hypotheses, like all other claims about the world, must face the tribunal of experience. And of course, another point here is that experience can't refute any hypothesis conclusively. So we might always be able to rehabilitate an apparently refuted theory, and that has happened in the past. You know, theories that were thought to be refuted ended up being resurrected again. So that's part of this tolerance of disagreement with respect to factual questions. They are all in principle. Well, none of them can be ruled out a priori, and maybe with, you know, changes in our experience, we might see that apparently refuted theories get rehabilitated. So that's the positive part of empiricism. And second, there is the negative part, and this is the resistance to metaphysics. In particular, empiricists target the kind of metaphysics that, to quote Van Fraassen, gives primacy to demands for explanation and proceeds by explanation by postulate. That is, giving explanations that postulate the reality of entities or aspects of the world not already evident in experience. And so we get a couple more characteristics of empiricism. 3. The rejection of demands for explanation at certain points. In metaphysics, there's a drive to provide explanations for anything, and, you know, the metaphysician is not satisfied with the claim that there might be certain brute facts. The metaphysician is not satisfied with just leaving things unexplained. Here's an example. Consider empirical regularities, like all copper conducts electricity. Now, a metaphysician will look at this and ask, okay, why does all copper conduct electricity? Give me explain this regularity. Now, we can investigate this scientifically. We might appeal to a theory about the behaviour of electrons, the underlying molecular structure of a piece of copper, and so on, to explain the electrical properties of copper in comparison to the electrical properties of other materials. But that's not what the metaphysician is getting at. This, you know, giving a scientific model just pushes the question one step back. Take our fundamental scientific theory, and let's suppose there are two types of fundamental particle, A and B, which both, you know, repel each other. Again, the metaphysician will ask, why does A repel B? And the way that she will explain this is by saying, well, because it's a law of nature that A repels B. The presence of A necessitates that B will be repelled. There is, you know, physical necessity, right? So we have these regularities in the world, and what underlies these regularities is physical necessity. So what the empiricist resists here is the notion that regularities require this kind of explanation in the first place, right? An empiricist, well, many empiricists at least, would be happy to say A and B repel each other. That's just the way the world is, right? Like, that's where explanation ends. So for more on this point, you should check out my videos on laws of nature. But, you know, this is a good example, I think, of where an empiricist will just say, like, it's just bizarre to think that you would even need to give an explanation of this kind, at least, right? Like, A and B are repulsive. A and B repel each other. That's just it, right? The idea that there needs to be kind of something behind that, or something grounding that, is not legitimate. Of course, the request for explanation, that's a natural expression of our curiosity, of our desire to push knowledge as far as it will go. But the metaphysician will count failure to explain these things as a mark against a theory, and she will construct theories merely for the purpose of explaining things that are not dealt with by the sciences. And it's here that the empiricist will demur. Not every demand for explanation is legitimate for the empiricist. Now, what is perhaps even more problematic is not the request for explanation, but the kind of explanations that metaphysics provides. So the fourth characteristic of empiricism is a strong dissatisfaction with explanations that proceed by postulation. So that is with explanations that proceed by postulating entities beyond what is given or what could be given in experience. For example, in metaethics, some philosophers attempt to explain ethics by treating it as providing true descriptions about a realm of non-natural moral values. There are certain features of our ethical discourse or certain intuitions we have about ethics or whatever for which the postulation of non-natural moral values is supposed to provide an explanation. Or consider philosophers who explain mathematics by postulating a Platonic realm of numbers and other mathematical objects of which mathematics provides true descriptions. Or philosophers who explain morality by postulating alternative possible worlds, either as abstract objects or as concrete entities that somehow exist without any spatio-temporal location to us. Or philosophers who explain scientific theories as providing true descriptions of structures in nature. Again, like certain features of accepted scientific theories, such as how scientists have used them to derive successful novel predictions, are said to require an explanation, and the explanation is, well, the theory is successful in that way because it provides a true description of the unobservable world, and so on and so on. Obviously we can multiply these kinds of examples endlessly. That gives you a sense of explanation by postulate that the empiricist resists. So that is the empiricist stance, and that's what that's where the empiricist resistance to metaphysics is going to come from. So how then is the empiricist to critique metaphysics? Well, at a minimum, it looks like the empiricist needs to do two things. First of all, the empiricist will say something about what in general is wrong with attempting to explain our practices by postulating aspects of the world beyond experience, of which these practices provide true descriptions. And secondly, the empiricist will give an alternative account of these practices. So let's take the first point. What's wrong with explanation by postulation, with explaining some area of discourse by postulating a realm of non-empirical facts about which that discourse provides true descriptions? Well, the empiricist can make several objections here. First of all, as we've seen, she might well say that the demand for explanation is just not legitimate in the first place, or at least the demand for the kind of explanation that the metaphysician is giving is not legitimate. So we might argue that ethics, mathematics, modality, and so on simply don't need this kind of explanation. But second, even if you accept the demand for the explanation, the empiricist will say, well, the explanation is often of no value, even on its own terms. One reason for this is that the metaphysician's explanation appeals to features that are less comprehensible than the things that we wanted to explain in the first place. So let's take modality. All people who can competently use the English language have a grasp of modal concepts of necessity, possibility, contingency, counterfactuals, and they know how to judge claims made using such concepts. Like, when I say, well, I could have put on a blue shirt this morning, I think, yeah, okay, that makes sense because I've got a blue shirt in my cupboard. There's nothing preventing me from getting in my cupboard. Like, I know that because I went into the cupboard this morning, etc., right? Like, I can reason in these kinds of ways. So, yeah, we all know how to use these concepts. We all know how to judge these concepts. Now, the metaphysician explains this discourse by the introduction of a realm of possible worlds. But, first of all, what on earth is a possible world? What is their nature? How do we know about them? How do they relate to one another? How do they ground the truth of modal claims? Right? We've just postulated an entity here, which like doesn't do any other work. It's not like we're it's not like we're, say, drawing on something that has a use in a bunch of other theories, like in the way that, in the way that in science, electrons are applied in lots of different theoretical contexts. No, we're just postulating this realm of entities, which itself raises all sorts of questions. It just opens up a whole load more problems than the one we started with. I should note here that the empiricist wouldn't object to analysing modal language in terms of possible worlds in the context of developing a formal logical theory, right? Like we can. The problem is with treating possible worlds as real entities that our modal language describes, rather than as potentially useful logical tools. So this is one problem, right? Like metaphysical explanations tend to just introduce things that make the subject less comprehensible than it was when we began. Another reason why these explanations are often of no value, even in their own terms, is that the metaphysical explanation interprets the discourse as delivering knowledge, but then it presents a picture of the world in which we are cut off from it cuts us off from the relevant facts. So again, you see that in the case of modal discourse, in the case of possible worlds, right? Like we don't have any access to possible worlds. They're either abstract, so they're not spatio-temporal, so we don't relate to them, or they're concrete, but they don't have a spatio-temporal connection to us, so there's no access we could have to them. Similarly, if you take mathematical Platonism, the postulation of abstract mathematical entities, well, they don't have spatio-temporal properties. They can't enter into causal relations. So there's this problem of epistemological access, right? How do they how do we get to them to learn about them? So compare this to the case of something like scientific models. Here, in this case, we can understand how, if they are true, we could come to know that they're true, because these models will postulate causal relations between ourselves and the entities we are studying. These models are therefore successful by their own lights. That's often not the case for metaphysics, right? If there are abstract mathematical entities in some Platonic realm, there's no connection to us. This is a way in which, even by its own lights, these explanations have problems. Indeed, there's a more general difficulty lurking, I guess, in the background here. Metaphysics, from an empiricist point of view, is in a sense self-sabotaging. I guess this point about these explanations being less comprehensible, or these explanations postulating things that cut us off from the relevant facts, that's self-sabotaging. But there's a broader way in which metaphysics is self-sabotaging. Metaphysical theories aim towards the truth. That's the goal of metaphysics, to provide a true theory of the world applied in the service of explaining particular things. But how are metaphysical theories evaluated? Well, from an empiricist point of view, metaphysics is forced to employ criteria of success that do not have any clear connection to the truth. So, obviously, no metaphysical theory is ever put to empirical test. There are no ontological experimentalists in philosophy departments, right? But what the metaphysician will do is to say, well, look, there's many different ways in which we judge theories. There's many different values and standards by which we judge theories. Empirical testing is just one of them. And these other values, actually, we can employ in metaphysics. So, in particular, metaphysics uses inference to the best explanation. And we find inference to the best explanation in the sciences and so on as well. So, this is a perfectly legitimate kind of inference. But in metaphysics, the criteria for judging the best explanation includes things like agreement with the metaphysician's intuitions, agreement with common sense, simplicity, the ability of the theory to render true as much of the discourse as possible, right? So, so what we want to do in postulating possible worlds is to make sure that our intuitions about which modal statements are true are correct. So here the empiricist is going to say, there's just no reason to think that these features are actually indicative of the truth of the metaphysical theory. There's no reason to suppose that, you know, our intuitions are correct with respect to metaphysical matters. Simplicity as well can be interpreted in all kinds of ways, and so on. Furthermore, even if these features were correlated with the truth, inference to the best explanation can only get you to the best explanation that you have actually come up with. It may be the best of a bad lot. So, again, so metaphysics aims towards the truth, but the criteria of success are not reliably going to lead you to the truth. And this is a big problem, because truth and the construction of true explanations is essentially the only benefit of metaphysical theorizing. In metaphysics, success consists in the selection of true theories. Failure consists in the selection of false theories, or in making no selection at all, so failing to find what you consider to be an adequate theory. That's all. There are no collateral gains and losses. Now, compare this with science. In science, as in metaphysics, truth is a success and falsity is a failure, at least if we're interested in constructing true scientific theories. But there are countless collateral gains and losses also. There is, there are the gains of increased safety, increased peace, better technology, better security, potential dangers, greater capacity for war, alienation from traditional ways of life, and so on, right? Like science has all of these practical applications, and so there are practical gains and practical risks. In metaphysics, there really is no practical value. The most we can ask is this theory true or false? Van Fraassen asks us to compare Newtonian mechanics with Cartesian dualism. Newtonian mechanics prevailed for over 2 centuries. Many people incorrectly took it to be an accurate picture of the underlying structure of the world. But over that time it provided enormous benefits. Indeed, it continues to provide enormous benefits to this day because we continue to apply Newtonian mechanics to make predictions. There are few people who would say that it would have been better had Newtonian mechanics never been developed. On the other hand, Cartesian dualism. Well, imagine if Cartesian dualism had not been considered fairly conclusively refuted, but had reigned for over 200 years as the dominant model of the mind. It probably wouldn't have gained much, right? What would the benefits of that have been? Well, I guess maybe we would have had an intuitively appealing explanation of some part of human life, right? There's certain features of consciousness of which Cartesian dualism gives us an intuitively appealing account, and that's basically it. That's as much as you're going to get. So, look, I should note I've been speaking in very general terms here because I'm talking about a general philosophical stance. Of course, there are many specific targets of metaphysical theorizing, ethics, mathematics, science, modality, universals, mind, and so on. A person might favour an empiricist account of some of these, but not all, while still embodying an empiricist stance. We might think, for instance, that ethics does not call for explanation in terms of postulation, whereas maybe the success of science does call for such an explanation. So yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, you can embody the empiricist stance to more or less of a degree. So that is the critique of the metaphysical explanation. Then there's the second element, the alternative account of the practice in question. What will the empiricist say here? Well, I mean, there are lots of different lines you can take on this. I will present just a few options. So one option is to just reject the discourse entirely. This is going to be the line taken by abolitionist error theorists with respect to moral discourse, or most atheists with respect to religious discourse. The view here will be that the practice is it's defective. It's based on mistaken or inadequately supported presuppositions. It doesn't actually bring anything useful into our lives. It's not actually successful. And so we should just eliminate it. We should just do away with it. Second, we might hold that the discourse, although it fails to track metaphysical facts, it's justified for pragmatic reasons. For example, error theorists who think of moral discourse as involving useful fictions. Similarly, fictionalists about mathematics, instrumentalists about scientific theories. So it's like, okay, we can think of a scientific theory as descriptive, right? Like the theory describes the world as being a certain way. It's false, but it's really useful. I mean, that's just how we treat Newtonian mechanics these days. We know that its description of the underlying structure of the universe is false, but it's very, very useful in various contexts. A third option is to say that the discourse is not properly interpreted as even attempting to state facts in the first place. This is the view of non-cognitivists about morality. They will say that moral judgments are not beliefs but expressions of emotions or preferences or plans or whatever. Or take take Hume's classic analysis of causality on some interpretations. Obviously, it is open to interpretation exactly how to take this, but when we judge that A causes B, partly we're simply asserting that there's a constant conjunction between A and B, so whenever A happens, B happens. But then there's this idea that there is a necessary connection between A and B, and a Humean line on this will be, well, that arises from the mind forming the habit of expecting B on seeing A and then projecting this expectation onto the objects themselves. And at least one way of interpreting that would be that causal claims therefore aren't really fact-stating. These are just examples. Other alternatives to metaphysical theorizing are available also. But, you can see that these are the sort of lines an empiricist can take in terms of providing an alternative account. There is an important thing to note here, though. In many cases, it's not really possible to avoid making metaphysical claims entirely. Suppose I adopt a non-cognitivist account of moral discourse. Well, in that case, I'm committed to the position that there are no objective moral facts, just because, on a non-cognitivist view, moral statements are not fact-stating in the first place. But that claim, there are no objective moral facts, is that not a metaphysical claim? I mean, in saying this, I am saying something about the underlying ontology of the world, about what the world contains. There's a difference, after all, between saying there are no objective moral facts and saying I don't know whether there are objective moral facts, right? Like, if you're saying there are no objective moral facts, that looks like a metaphysical claim, a claim about the nature of the world. So you might think, well, surely that's metaphysics. That should be unacceptable to the empiricist. But remember that on the view I've articulated here, empiricism is a stance, not a belief. And if I'm a non-cognitivist about morality, what I'm certainly not doing, I'm certainly not saying that moral discourse is grounded in metaphysical facts or explained by metaphysical facts. I'm not explaining morality by postulating a realm of entities beyond experience of which moral discourse can provide true or false descriptions. It's this kind of metaphysics, explanation by postulation, against which the empiricist rebels. So yes, we may well be committed to all kinds of beliefs, right, which seem to, in some sense, go beyond experience, right? So, to say that there are no objective moral facts, that maybe there's a sense there in which that goes beyond experience, but it's specifically about how these beliefs are applied in the service of explanations that empiricists are going to take a stance against. So anyway, that's empiricism, or at least that is empiricism as people like Van Fraassen see it. Well, I hope you found that interesting. That is all I have to say today. So thanks for watching.